Hi everyone. We're about halfway through the semester, give or take, and you have been writing kind of a first segment of autocritigraphical essays in which you've been connecting personal narrative with critical literary analysis, something new to most of you. As we continue to pursue our work in this genre, we're going to start adding a few more elements, and that's what this instructional video is going to talk about today. So let's get started. I have a slide here that actually came from one of the first videos that we watched together called Autocritography 101. And it discussed in that video how autocritography as a genre developed as a theoretical lens for addressing social justice concerns. Its argument, therefore, develops at the intersection of secondary research, self-reflection, and critical analysis. As the writer connects self-reflection and critical analysis, relationships between texts likely emerge, but this self-reflection does not negate the significance of an essay's critical engagements. In fact, it augments that impact of the critical through its attention to relevance. So just to kind of recap here, we looked at Michael Awkward's definition from 1999, and I've bolded here his points about that it's self-reflexive, self-consciously, an academic act. Also, it's an account of individual social and institutional conditions that help to produce a scholar, teacher, and hence his or her professional concerns. I've also added to this slide kind of some of the key points that we talked about in that early lecture. Autocritigraphy provides a framework for critical analysis, which is necessarily argument-driven and evidence-based. It draws upon intertextuality to support genre bending, and it constitutes a scholarly endeavor. Many of you are already incorporating theory, scholarship, or intertextuality in your work, or you've done this previously for another course's critical analysis assignment. So this video instruction may be a review, but it will provide you some ideas for connecting your previous writing experiences to your autocritigraphical essay writing for this course. Ultimately, framing and integrating help to connect your ideas in a way that conveys a more cohesive sense of their holistic significance to a reader. For framing, we'll focus on three critical theories used in literary analysis: narrative theory, feminist theory, and place theory. I chose these among a lot of options because of their potential applications to all of the memoir options that we are reading in this course. For integrating, we will discuss how to integrate secondary research, intertextual connections between primary texts, and paratexts in your work. These, of course, are only a few examples, and your essays are not limited to these approaches. Each segment will begin with a metaphor for thinking about these concepts, demonstrate how your work in this course is already drawing upon some of these concepts, and break down the foundations and developments in a category so that it provides you time to consider potential applications. Finally, I should clarify that these approaches can be used alone or combined in your work. In fact, they often build upon one another or speak to one another in your writing. So let's get started. When I think about framing, I'm reminded of Mike Ball's anecdote about visiting Ken Aptegar, who's an artist, visiting his work at a Soho exhibit. When she walked into the gallery, it began with an empty frame, like a larger size frame. And that frame, you could look through the center of it, and your eye was kind of guided through the progression of the rest of the pieces on display. And this is how I imagine framing. It kind of gives an outline to the work, to the analysis that you're doing. It connects all of those pieces together. It guides your eye, or in this case, your reader's reading and that process of reading through a particular kind of progression, connecting all of the different moving parts. Oftentimes, students have different experience engaging with critical literary theories, and that's okay for this class. We're going to talk about 3 of them today, but just know that there are a lot of different options. But the way I like to think about critical theory just kind of in general is an eyeglass exam. So imagine when you go to the eye doctor to have your eyes tested. The first part of the exam, they're looking at your eye health, but the second part of the exam, if you need glasses so that you can see clearer, they'll use a machine like this, and I don't know what this is called, but they'll set it in front of your face and have you look out at the screen in front of you and ask you if you can read the letters easier or if they're more difficult to read. So I often struggle at this point of the eyeglass exam because I worry that I'm going to answer the question wrong and I'm going to get home and my prescription isn't going to be correct and I won't see as clearly. But they take one side and they look at one side at the time. So they look at the right eye and they flip between different options until they find the correct lens that you can see the clearest out of the right eye. Then they do the next with the left eye, and then they do it together. Together, then, you get this kind of combination of being able to see more clearly than you did in one eye versus the other, or perhaps before you needed a new prescription altogether. In fact, we're already using critical theory as a frame in this class. We haven't called it this, but autocrittography in many ways draws upon reader response theory, which is just one literary theory lens, and it positions the reader as part of a text performance, filling its gaps and providing for different readings and interpretations. Like all one lens readings, reader response alone results in an increased level of uncertainty in the text. But your responses to reading in autocrittography, as I mentioned, especially during the first portion of the semester, align closely with this theoretical approach. In Democratic Vistas, Walt Whitman writes that books are to be called for and supplied on the assumption that the process of reading is not a half-sleep, but, in the highest sense, an exercise, a gymnast struggle, that the reader is to do something for himself, must be on the alert, must himself or herself construct indeed the poem, argument, history, metaphysical essay, the text furnishing the hints, the clue, the start, or framework. Not the book needs so much to be the complete thing, but the reader of the book does. Whether the theory that you're working with focuses on relationships with readers, focuses on the text itself and that relationship and the construction of the text, or looks at context such as the socio-historical context of a reading and literary production. It works best to think about multiple lenses and how they are related to one another and how they are informing one another to guide us through a more enriched reading. So let's look at the first one that I've selected together. Narrative theory is also called narratology. It's developed from structuralism, new criticism, and formalist ways of reading texts. It's less grounded in the reader than the text itself, so different from reader response theory. You'll recognize its roots as a close reading. We hear about this a lot in English studies, and I once actually had a professor who called it the bread and butter of English studies, that close reading was the bread and butter of English studies, and I agree. But it has the addition of a kind of scientific approach to examining how textual arrangement, narrative decisions, and literary elements and usage convey meaning about the human experience. Like reader response theory's limited focus on the reader, narrative theory's focus on the text does not include the historical and sociocultural contexts that inform audiences' readings and literary production. In the mid-1980s, though, Susan Lancer rightly argued that we need to incorporate these contexts since readings and productions are not conceived and implemented in a vacuum. And her seminal essay, listed in the bibliography at the end of this video, initiated a feminist and later queering of narrative theory to emphasize these relationships between text and context over time. The next one I want to talk about is feminist theory, which we just talked a little bit in terms of Susan Lancer. Certainly, Lancer's thinking about feminist narratology developed from this, which has a long history of response to single-lens approaches to critical analysis across disciplines. In literature, feminist theory is one of the many responses, think also about Marxism, ethnic studies, and LGBTQ theory, to new criticism, and it incorporates the historical and sociocultural impetuses embedded in reading and literary production. Some of the feminist theory's primary focuses include gender inequalities, social roles and expectations for men and women, reproductive rights, workplace issues, oppression, patriarchy, sexuality, motherhood, and so forth, all interested in the role of power structures in discourse. While historically feminisms were not always inclusive across marginalized groups and representations of groups, 21st century feminist praxis privileges critical thinking, leadership as empowerment, shared purpose through community, and connecting knowledge and experiences for social transformation, which is very related to Janice Ray's approach to environmental conservation and Wild Card Quilt. The last theory that I want to highlight today is place theory. It's perhaps one of the most contemporary lenses that we're going to discuss in this video, and it's aligned to some extent with eco-criticism. Place theory, like feminist theory, originates outside of English studies, but is often applied through readings of literary texts. Tim Cresswell, Edward Soja, and Gillian Rose are just some of the geographers who consider relationships between geographic place and human engagements with place. Place, as Tim Cresswell argues, is how we make the world meaningful. But like the analysis of discourse and narrative in feminist theory, it is also invested with meaning in the context of power, since who controls the discourse of place says something about who gets to participate in the construction and dissemination of meanings for places. This emphasis on power structures relates to eco-criticism, which Greg Girard defines as the study of relationships of the human and non-human through human cultural history, and entailing critical analysis of the term human itself. While this arises from ecological science, it's not defined by that science. Girard also argues that eco-criticism has a moral and political agenda. You might think about this moral and political agenda when we consider concepts of wilderness, both historically and socioculturally, especially in the United States. In many ways, wilderness is an ideology constructed, maintained, or revised by narrative. Consider the differences between approaches to American wilderness during the country's colonization and founding versus contemporary narratives about wilderness. Among other wilderness examinations, Roderick Nash asserts in his book called Wilderness and the American Mind, which is also included in the bibliography, that the American wilderness constituted an alien space to be cultivated and tamed until the early 20th century, when American wilderness evolved into a space in need of saving from cultivation and civilization. There was a lot of information in the past 3 slides about potential critical theory frames for your next phase of autocritigraphical writing. First, remember that your work is not limited to these frames and that the best lens is often a multi versus single lens, or uses of connections between multiple critical theories instead of focusing on just one. Second, keep in mind that this instructional video is a very brief overview of the concepts and that you'll need to dig deeper using the bibliography at the end of the video, reading further as you work through your writing process. So to that end, I often find it more helpful to think about the kinds of questions that critical theories incite as I consider ways to use it to frame my readings and analyses. Take a moment to reflect on some of these questions and think of your own related to the particular memoir that you're reading for the course. First, how does narrative arrangement, such as the arrangement of episodic memories, convey holistic meaning? Or, what are the power structures embedded in the memoir's retellings that drive or limit access to discourse? How does a particular memoir privilege and convey historical, sociocultural, and/or political moment? Finally, what relationships between narrative, readership, author, or setting emerge that speak to one or more of these critical lenses. The final segment of this video is going to be a bit shorter than the first because you're likely already familiar with and using most of these approaches already. So when I think of integrating connections and relationships in any writing genre, but especially autocartography, I envision this M.C. Escher lithograph. The artist is both holding the sphere and seeing himself in the sphere. A close reading would immediately take note of the setting behind Escher. The bookshelves lining the walls, the window that offers knowledge about what exists beyond the room, the seating arrangement, and Escher himself, staring at both himself and the audience simultaneously. And yet, the sphere distorts what and how we see, even as our eyes are drawn to the fact that Escher's hand holds the sphere. It is a Derrida-like redoubling, in which there can be no satisfying resolution, only further questions. Yet, these questions are also opportunities for considering relationships between the text and artist, image and portrayal of image, and sites of audiencing. You're already considering these kinds of relationships, especially between texts, in your work with Naming What We Know. As David Rusin argues, the role of intertextuality in our writing that is always present, whatever meaning a writer or reader makes of a particular text, is not a result of their engagements with that particular text alone. Rather, than existing as autonomous documents, texts always refer to other texts and rely heavily on those texts to make meaning. So let's take a look at some of the ways of integrating text and context into your autocritigraphical writing, whether or not you choose to use a critical frame like theory to connect these integrations. First, take a moment to read this autocritigraphical excerpt from an essay I shared with you earlier in the course. Likely you're most familiar with this integration. Think the assignment requires a certain number of peer-reviewed secondary research sources, right? We see this kind of assignment all the time. But what do you notice about the way in which Collins's work integrates with the close reading in this particular excerpt? Let's look at the next one. Often we're asked to focus on only one primary text, bolstered by secondary research like the previous slide. But in critical analysis, comparative readings that use intertextuality often strengthen the significance of a single reading. Take a moment to read this example. What do you notice about this integration? And just for a real quick style reminder, for both of this slide and the previous one, make sure that you avoid dropped quotes or quotes that are not integrated into the text through contextualization. For example, if I just drop the quote from Maya Angelou's poem into the initial sentences without providing an initial concept that connects it to Graham's work, the reader would not understand that relationship. The narrative decisions you make about both selecting text and context, as well as the signposting those relationships between text and context, serve to guide the reader through your analysis. Both are important. Finally, we don't think about paratext often, but Gerard Genette, one of the narrative theorists mentioned in the first half of the video, wrote a book entitled Paratext and talked about how paratexts inform our reading. Paratexts are materials and contexts related to the text but not produced by the author, such as reviews of a particular text, both from readers and from critical reviewers. the designs that are on the front of a book's cover, frontispieces, which we don't see as often in books now, but certainly in 19th century books and earlier, there's often some kind of an illustration in the first few pages that served as kind of the focus illustration for the rest of the book. In-text illustrations within a book. Marginalia, which is essentially studying what other people are writing in a book. I often think about this in some of my research with Catherine Ann Porter at the University of Maryland. They have her entire library set up from her lifetime, and it's really interesting to me to have the opportunity to look at the marginalia, or her notes in the books that she collected for her library, because she's having a conversation with that text within that space. Also, author and publisher information is often a paratext. Maybe an author's biography in some way informs our reading of a particular text, or a publisher's notoriety, for instance. And then interviews and press releases. Janice Ray's memoir, for instance. Janice Ray has an interview that I often include in the course, and it illuminates a little more. It was taken earlier on, before she wrote Wild Card Quilt, but it illuminates her engagement with her first book, Ecology, and talks a little bit about the impetuses for her writing. Integrating paratexts involves an additional kind of close reading, such as analyzing these illustrations, or additional research, such as locating the author interviews or reviews about your memoir. But like my conversation earlier in the theory section about cultural studies, by pairing those contemporary responses to texts, we often get an enriched reading of a particular text. So let's take a moment to review and reflect on these last three components, just like our segment on framing. What kinds of questions can you think about that might prompt our integration of text and context into autocartography? We might consider, does the memoir reference another text, or does my reading induce memories from my reading of another text that would enrich how to convey the significance of those readings to a reader? How does secondary research further support or complicate my argument in a critical analysis? Or to what extent does this paratext, book cover, review, interview, authors or publishers' notoriety influence my reading? When you're done, take a moment to look at the bibliographic slides that follow this final reflection to locate potential sources for your framing and integrating. I look forward to reading your future essays.